This is The Shattered Castle, chapters 20 and 21. By the time I made it back into the throne room, Imogen was already on the dais with Castor. He was standing and holding her hand midway between them, which looked awkward and forced, but Imogen's smile was more convincing than I would have liked. Wilta stood beside Castor, eyes forward, but this time her mother repeated the announcement that had been given earlier from the castle balcony. Castor Veldegrath shall be the steward of Carthia, subject to our monarch and yours. Hail, Wilta Strick, your monarch. Hail to the monarch, the people cried out. Hail to your steward, Castor Veldegrath. Hail to the steward, the people echoed, several of them my former regents. Castor stepped forward with Imogen, and my gut twisted. As is the Carthian tradition, the betrothed is to the throne. With the unfortunate loss of King Jaron, it is appropriate that I offer marriage to his betrothal. A cheer rose around me, but I nearly collapsed in place. This was what they had been discussing all this time. Never quite saying the words, but speaking so plainly, I should have known. Castor had promised the ultimate revenge on me. He wouldn't get that through taking my throne or my title. His revenge would be to take Imogen from me. And his revenge was working. I already felt myself splitting in half. Castor continued, "You have loved her as a people, and I will love her as she loves me. With our marriage, we will forever unite Carthia to Proseria, to Imogen, and to our marriage." My head was spinning. This could not be possible, or it could not be a part of Imogen's plans, not now that she knew I was alive. But she did know it, and there she was, beside him. He looked to Imogen, who merely stared forward and said, "Thank you, Steward Veldegrath. I will consider your offer." The people cheered her words, but my eyes were on Castor, who looked furious. Obviously, Imogen was supposed to accept his proposal just now, and that did worry me. She would not be allowed to defy him, not if she was supposed to get the people on his side. From where she stood on the dais, Imogen found me. Our eyes locked. And though there wasn't the slightest betrayal of recognition in her expression, I felt some hope that she had looked for me at all. Then, in an almost imperceptible move, she shook her head at me. What did that mean? The announcement was followed by a celebration in which Carthian nobles, several of my former regents, and other notable men and women of the country greeted Castor as their steward, though most turned away with grimaces and sighs. I felt some comfort in that. The nobles didn't like me any more than I liked them, but that was only because I was arrogant, rude, and impossible to work with. But Castor was worse. "Pardon me." Imogen's mother had inadvertently backed into me. I put my head down and realized she was in conversation with Captain Strick. Batilda returned to her conversation. "You must forgive my informal appearance tonight. I had the most lovely wig intended for this evening, but I must have left it at Elmhaven." "Proserians do not wear wigs," Strick said. "It is a wasteful luxury." "Oh, I agree, of course. I had only hoped there might be an exception in celebration of tonight's announcement." Batilda thought a moment longer. "It didn't go the way I expected. That announcement was supposed to be for a marriage. Your daughter just humiliated Lord Veldegrath up there. You'd better speak to her before Wilta does it." "I will, Captain Strick. I don't know why she changed her mind like that." "Obviously, Jaron is too fresh in her mind. We will never have control over this country until Jaron is forgotten. That will be the next phase in our plan." I wanted to hear more of the conversation, but looking beyond them into the corridor, I saw a sudden rush of 8 or 9 Proserian soldiers racing down the stairs. Their swords were raised. Something big was happening. I left the throne room and hurried to catch up to the others, asking the nearest soldier about the disturbance. "We found one of the escapees," he said as he brushed past me. It probably wasn't Leviticus, but the soldier might not be talking about the dungeon escapees. There was also the escape from the innermost keep. At the bottom of the steps, someone shouted, "There he is!" The group gave chase, and I followed, all of us racing to the northwest corner of the castle, where my private study had been before the Prosarians turned it to the pebbles and dust. That's when I caught my first glance of Tobias. He was a fast runner, but not fast enough, and the Prosarians had him trapped in a corner. He turned, raising a long sword that took both hands for him to manage, and yelled, "Take one step closer, and I will strike you down." I admired his boldness and courage, and for a few seconds his threat seemed to work. But then whoever was commanding the soldiers ordered, "Get him on his knees." 5 soldiers rushed forward. To his credit, Tobias got in at least one good swipe, though, with a long sword. It would have been impossible for him not to hit someone. The remaining 4 soldiers disarmed him and quickly forced him to his knees. Tobias looked up at them. "When I kneel, it is only to Jaron, the true king of Carthia." "Then you kneel to a grave." The man who had spoken kicked Tobias in the side, and he fell to the ground. "Where are the others who were with you?" the commander shouted. "I saw them," I said. "Follow me." The commander left orders for 3 of his men to bind Tobias's hands and to care for the soldier he had injured. As I led the others away, I heard Tobias said, "I'll see to his wounds if you don't tie me up." 5 soldiers were with me, including the commander. I led them into the kitchen, which was bustling with activity for the celebration upstairs. I looked around, hoping to see a woman I'd always called cook. She was sending a tray of food out the door, so I waited until she looked directly at me before I said, "Did I just see 3 Carthians run through here?" "When?" She began to shake her head. This time with more meaning, I added, "Did you see them cook?" A smile spread across her face. She recognized me. "Oh, yes," she said, perhaps with too much theater in her tone, but it would have to do. "Oh, yes, I did see them. Big and mangy and—" Before she enjoyed this too much, I interrupted, "I think they jumped into the river below." She suppressed a smile, for she knew very well that as a boy I had escaped the castle on several occasions by opening a latch in the kitchen floor and jumping through it into the river. My tutors never followed me because they knew how disgusting the water was once the kitchen staff dumped all their food scraps into it. But Klook clearly understood the game I wanted to play. She opened the latch and said, "Why, yes, they did jump." The soldiers looked down into the river, more clogged than usual because of the preparations for the guest upstairs. The commander frowned up at me. "You expect us to jump into that river?" "No, you'd be a fool to jump in there," I said. "We have one of the escapees. The monarch would never expect you to pursue the other 3. "I'll jump," one of the soldiers said. "I want the gratitude of the monarch when I capture those prisoners." With a nod from his commander, he held his nose and jumped, immediately followed by a second soldier. "The rest of you should get in there too," the commander said. The other 2 soldiers took their turns, and I realized the commander had been staring at me. His eyes narrowed. "Aren't you—" "In you go." I yanked on his coat to pull him forward. He lost his balance and fell into the river. Behind me, Cook began laughing. "It reminds me of old times, my king." She dipped her head at me, then returned to her duties. I peeked down the hole again, watching the commander float downriver with the others. They'd be caught by the rubbish gate before long. I'd have to not cross paths with them, at least until I was better armed. I closed the latch to prevent them from climbing back into the kitchen, then turned, immediately crashing into the last person I ever wanted to see here, Mercy. He reached for a sleeve of my coat, but I wheeled around and picked up a tray full of dishes, throwing them at him. They crashed to the floor, leaving him with several cuts on his face. A soldier appeared behind him and picked up a frying pan, a big one, intended for me. I ran instead to the hearth where a kettle was boiling. I picked it up and threw the liquid towards the soldier. He ducked, so most of it landed on Mercy, who screeched with pain. The soldier leapt forward and tackled me to the ground, then called for the cooks to bring him a knife. No one responded. When he called again, it became obvious they had fled the kitchen entirely. The soldier pressed his knee into my gut and looked over at Mercy, whose skin was already showing the marks of burns. "What do you want me to do with him?" he asked. "You insolent servant boy, throw him in the dungeons," Mercy said, with his hands pressed over his eyes. "I've got to do something about this burn." He turned and immediately bumped into a brick pillar. If he could see, it wasn't much. By then, at least 10 other Prosarians had gathered around the kitchen. The soldier got off me, and I checked my stomach, certain he had left a permanent indentation there. Tobias was already chained in one cell when I was brought into the dungeon. The Prosarians shoved me into a second cell. I raised my trouser leg for them to put the chain on, but a soldier kicked me off my feet and added a few more kicks to my gut and ribs until he was satisfied. Someone chained my leg, and then they closed the bars. "You must be named Weakling," I said to the soldier who had kicked me, though I was sure the very opposite must be true. He said, "If you think that was bad, wait until the monarch hears what you did to her counselor. You will wish you were already dead." "Some would say I already am dead," I replied. "I'll stay as vigil," Weakling said to the other soldiers. "Go and inform the monarch what has happened to Lord Trench's eyes." I tried to get back into a sitting position, but I barely slept since yesterday's attack, and I felt the weight of exhaustion now. Tobias was speaking to me. I knew that, but I only mumbled, "Let me close my eyes for a minute, Tobias." "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "Let me sleep, or there's a chance that I will be." I quickly drifted off, expecting pleasant dreams. After all, I was living in the nightmare. Chapter 21. I wasn't sure of the time when I awoke. I felt as though I had slept for hours, so perhaps it was morning, but there was no way to be sure. The dungeons were colder than I'd realized, and I was shivering. There was something else I'd have to look at changing after I got my castle back. I was still in my servant's clothes, but my sword was gone. I sat up and leaned against the dungeon wall, still aware of the cuts on my back and now fully aware of what Weakling's boot had done to my gut. Truthfully, I'd always expected to be locked in these dungeons one day, though I had thought it would come when I was young and my father was trying to teach me some sort of lesson. Unexpectedly, our vigil this morning was Haddon. He was staring directly at me. "You marched into Drilia with me yesterday," he said. "So are you a servant who disguised himself as a stewardman, or are you a stewardman in disguise as a servant?" I frowned. "That's not your business. Leave us alone now." "No, I'm the vigil here." I pointed at Tobias. "Do you see that regent in the cell across from me? When he wakes up, he'll need my help to escape. Think about how difficult that will be if you're still here." Haddon leaned across toward the bars. "That regent is planning to escape?" "I expect both of us will, and when we do, you're going to be blamed for it if you're still here, so you better go upstairs." "I'll stop the escape," he replied. "What finer way to prove myself to my superiors?" "You have no superiors among the Prosarians," I said. "You're a decent person, Haddon. Don't compromise that by serving those people." He straightened up. "I serve them willingly." "What a pity." I forgot him and turned instead to Tobias, calling his name. He seemed determined to remain asleep, so I grabbed a small rock from my cell and I tossed it across the path between our cells. It hit him on the shoulder, but he merely rolled over on the hard stone. "We need to talk," I said. "Now?" "I'm awake now." "Well, I was awake last night." "Yeah, but I'm awake now, so sit up. Let's talk." While Tobias groaned and pushed himself to a sitting position, I turned to Haddon. "You still here?" "This is where I've been assigned." "Well, this is also where we're going to say things that you will not want to have heard." He remained where he was, and I added, "That sword at your side?" He put his hand on the pommel. "What of it?" "I'm going to use it against you in about 2 minutes unless you leave this area." He frowned at me and then turned and walked upstairs. Tobias leaned towards me. "I can't believe that worked." "It didn't work. He'll be back, and he won't be alone. So in what little time we have, I know about Kerwin, but please tell me about Harlow." His injuries are serious, but if Mott gets him safely away, Amorinda knows what to do. Where will they go? I wouldn't take any risks by telling him about Farthenwood, so I simply replied, hopefully far enough away to stay out of Castor's reach. Tobias arched a brow. Why is that? Harlow is next in line for the throne, and you after that. Both of you stand in Castor's way to holding the crown. Levitimus, are you still in here? His voice called from the cell further down from me. And where else would I be? Enjoying your freedom if you had escaped with the others last night. Well, how would that have benefited me? He replied. I'm here to find the treasure. But you know where it is. You've known all along. You could have escaped and sought it yourself. Even from here, I heard Levitimus sigh. Would you consider yourself a patient person, Jaron? Only if nothing else works, I said. My leg had been bouncing for the last 10 minutes, eager to move. Tobias snorted, which I supposed was his opinion on that question of my patience. Levitimus spoke again. I have never been their prisoner. I have merely waited for events to unfold that would allow me to get what I want. Well, I hope whatever you've waited for all these years is worth it. This is my life's work. I have collected 1,000 years of history to be added to the life's work of scholars from 1,000 years before that. All that I must do is find their book. It is hidden with the rest of the treasure. Nothing in this world matters more to me than that book. Much as I tried, I could not understand patience like that. So why didn't you find the treasure and get the book? What were you waiting for all this time? His laugh was soft, as if I had made a joke. I suppose I was waiting for you. I'll help you find the treasure, but only on one condition. You must promise to give me the book. I already told you, I said. I don't care about the treasure anymore. I got bigger problems. Such as the sound of the dungeon door upstairs opening again. We were out of time. Levitimus continued, Jaron, you are the monarch's captive now, and whether you care about it or not, she will force you to find the treasure for her. Well, then tell me where it is, and you and I will get right to it. How can you not know already? Levitimus asked. Do you understand so little of your own history? If I did, this wasn't the time for a history lesson. Boots were pounding down the circular stair towards us. Right now, I am far more concerned with Carthia's future. Can anything in that treasure help me with that? The book can, but you must promise that to me. You can have the book, Levitimus, but I hope there's more to the treasure than that. The treasure is at once everything and nothing, except for that book. How can Jaron find the treasure? Tobias asked Levitimus. The scope and lenses were lost in Belland. Neither of us answered him, and after a very long pause, Tobias said, Oh, Jaron, you didn't. I set my jaw forward. Well, they were always going to come. We knew that from the moment we left Belland. Seconds later, 3 vigils arrived. Haddon had returned with Weakling and a third soldier who I didn't bother naming because I doubted he'd be around much longer. He looked cruel enough, and I'd have to go after him first. Levitimus, I have one other question for you. I leaned forward and glared at each of the 3 soldiers who had come. You've been a captive of the Prosarians for a long time. I can't tell which of these vigils is the stupidest. Maybe you can advise me? The vigils looked at one another. Weakling rattled the bars of my cell with his sword and said, Be quiet. As they wished, in a whisper I said, I only ask because the stupidest one will think he's going to survive the next few minutes. The other 2 will have the good sense to leave while they can. Weakling laughed. You're hardly in a position to make any threats. Yes, obviously I am now, but my threat remains the same. Haddon started to reach for the set of keys hanging from the wall, and while I would have welcomed a personal visit, Levitimus spoke and said, Tobias, tell me something about Carthia. I leaned my head against the wall and sat forward again when the rock scratched my back. So there would be a history lesson after all, I groaned. Must we do this now? Might save our lives. I highly doubt that. But Levitimus's distraction did seem to work. Haddon replaced the keys, and the posture of all three Prosarians relaxed. Carthia is more than 1,000 years old, Tobias said, founded by three siblings, Ingor, Phelan, and Linus, all who left their homeland to establish a kingdom of their own. At first, they ruled as equals. While the three rulers worked together, Carthia was the strongest country in the land. As the story goes, Phelan had a book that taught them to build powerful weapons and how to trade with foreign kingdoms to build wealth, which they did with great success. But over time, disagreements arose among them. Each became so focused on what they wanted most, they began to see the others as threats. You see, Ingor wanted Carthia to become a trading empire, the wealthiest country in all the lands. Phelan wanted an educated country, the wisest in all the lands. Linus wanted to fight, to be a nation of conquerors. Tobias paused and glanced over at me. We should talk more about this. This one lesson is plenty. I should have saved my sleep for now. I'd closed my eyes to rest again, but I was fairly sure that Tobias made a face at me before continuing. Phelan tried to persuade her brothers that Carthia was the strongest when their three goals were united as one. But the two kings saw the wishes of the others as threats to their own desires. In the end, Ingor killed Phelan. Then Linus killed Ingor and all those who supported him, and he became the sole survivor of the rulers. Jaron Artolius Egbert III, I said, proud descendant of someone who would kill his own brother and sister to get his way. I pushed my hair out of my eyes. What more do we need to talk about, Tobias? He hesitated. Not here. I disagree. Your story almost bored these vigils to death. Keep talking and I won't have to do anything to them. I looked over at the vigils. Have you forgotten I'm going to hurt you all? You're almost out of time and I promise to leave scars. Get out of this dungeon now. We're waiting for further orders from the monarch, Haddon said. You're not going to be conscious when those orders come. I pointed to Weakling. You ought to switch your sword to the opposite side. Where you have it now, I'll have no trouble grabbing it from you. He frowned but stepped back, placing his hand on the sword. When he thought I wasn't looking, he quietly rotated his belt to the other side of his hip. Levitimus sighed. You kick against the bricks of walls you have built yourself? He always has, Tobias added. Maybe so. I kept my eye on Weakling and my smile widened. Far better than to remain locked within them. Come on, Tobias. Let's get out of here now.